Hey, my name is Zachary, and I'm interested in finding new ways to appreciate art. Today, I want to talk about some art that I made, just my own personal music that I've created. And this is going to be an appropriative collage in the classical sonata form. So I'm going to describe a little bit of the situation that I was in, the problems I was looking to solve while making this music. At the time, I really enjoy, and I still do, really enjoy avant-garde music and experimental music. And both of these literally mean something like innovative music. Unfortunately, the experiments that have been done for experimental music, they've been done. And they've been the same for the last 50 years or something. So it's really not innovative anymore. It doesn't really make sense to call it innovative. Anyhow, I do enjoy listening to music that uses non-standard musical practices. That's what we're going to call it. Quite a bit after the time I started enjoying experimental music and really getting into it, I started looking into classical music and becoming more exposed to classical music, and specifically learning about the classical musical forms. I read this book by Arnold Schoenberg called The Fundamentals of Musical Composition, and later I read a book by William Kaplan, called Sonata Forms. Wait, no, it's called Classical Forms. With these two broad traditions forming in my mind, both the experimental music and the classical music, I wondered if experimental music could be arranged in a large scale classical form, like the sonata form. And I wondered this, but I never found any example of this. I did not find much to satisfy my curiosity. There are some examples of very famous classical music, classical works being kind of reorchestrated or rearranged to fit into synthesizers with some other experimental elements. They're not just doing instrumentation changes, there's other things going on. And I also am aware of some experimental music that is meant to be or seemingly in classical form. Like there's something by a guy named Alain Savaret. It's called Sonata Baroque.
Point virgule.
Point virgule.
I actually really like this piece. It seems to be in classical form because the titles of the songs are representative of different sections in classical music, in a sonata form particularly, but I can't hear it. Like I don't notice, just listening to it, I can't really tell when we're moving from the exposition to the development phase to the recapitulation. It doesn't really actually make sense while listening to it, though I can read it in the titles. So I don't actually think it is in classical form. But really, other than those types of things, there's not much, nothing that I know of where we're actually getting discernible classical form and having the sort of non-standard musical practices, what is normally called experimental music, in that classical form. So I decided to make something myself. I decided to use the norms of the genre called musique concrète, which is translated to concrete music, which I could also further translate to just real music. It's a French term, as you can tell by the way I pronounce that. There's a whole philosophy behind it. It generally means that we're using recordings as our musical primitives, as opposed to using notes that instruments make. So you don't want to use, you're not arranging notes, you're arranging recordings. And more specifically, I'm using the norms of a genre called plunder phonics, which is kind of a subsection of musique concrète. This can be translated to audio piracy, but it really just means appropriative collage. You're appropriating music and putting in dual collage. So instead of using notes from instruments as the musical primitives, you're going to be using samples from existing music, not just any old recording, specifically existing music as the musical primitives, and you're arranging samples from existing music. This also comes with its own philosophy, which I, at the time, did subscribe to. In short, it's the idea that all creation is a form of transformation of something that already exists. So fundamentally, there's no difference between arranging notes from the existing 12-tone scale that come from existing instruments like a piano or a violin. There's no difference from that and arranging sounds that are from pre-recorded music and using those to create something new, because fundamentally all creation is the rearrangement of something that already exists. So Plunderphonics is really just highlighting this nature of creativity or art or whatever. As an aside, there's a radio show from John Lidecker, and it's amazing. It's called Variations. It's on the Radio Web MACBA.
Hello, my name is John Lidecker, and welcome to the first of a 6-episode series called Variations, covering the history of appropriative collage in music, new compositions made using recordings of older ones.
It's all about the history of appropriative collage. I highly, highly, highly recommend it, especially if you're into kind of weird music and you want to understand a wide range of this type of appropriative collage. It starts with some classical era music, not classical era music, sorry. It starts with classical music in the modern era, like Charles Ives, and it goes into like sampling, like for hip hop and that kind of stuff. But all of the different forms of sampling and all of the different variations of it, it's a great show. Just go listen to that. So my main aim was to put appropriative collage into classical form. So I decided to create a full sonata cycle, a 4-movement classical piece. Now, what does it even mean to be in classical form? I'm going to give you a brief overview here. For the purposes of this project, classical form means a set of norms for presenting musical themes, contrasting those musical themes, and then transforming those musical themes. In broad strokes, I want to create clear thematic sections, which could be easily distinguished by any listener. And I want to create modulations and transformations of those sections, which could be noticed by an attentive listener. For this work, I created some specialized language for constructing themes and translating themes. And I mapped the concept of a genre within the recordings and map that into a musical key of the actual song that I'm working with. That might sound a little confusing. It'll make more sense as I actually give examples here. So, all right, for the first movement. We have a work here. It is an appropriative collage, and it is in sonata form, classical music form. The first movement is called Lost in Paradise, and is also the name of the whole sonata cycle. For this piece, for this section, I use samples from a genre called exotica as my musical primitives. So these samples are not at all modified beyond just cutting them out of their original recordings, and there's no sound effects processing at all for this movement. The genre I chose here is especially important for the work because exotica itself is a form of appropriation. It's cultural appropriation. Exotica might be seen as what an American views of like exotic music. It's essentially music from Polynesia or from Asia or from Africa or from, you know, the Arabic world or whatever. It's like that type of music, kind of vaguely foreign music sounding to an American or a Westerner. This is an amazing genre of music. I absolutely love it. I love the first of all, I like the appropriation aspect. I like sharing ideas across different cultures or seeing the beauty in a different culture's style of works of art and then kind of using that into your own music. I like that general idea in itself. I like how it sounds, the vibe of it. It makes me feel so chill and cool. I like it all. Okay. So that's the genre of exotica. It's really cool. In this work, I create two major themes. It's kind of common for sonata form. We have two contrasting themes. So I make two themes, I try to contrast them, and then I attempt to reconcile them. Again, that's common for sonata form. So the first theme is made with a particular style of exotica that focuses on mostly percussion instruments. I'm going to call this true exotica or primitive exotica. There's no actual name for this. No one calls it these things, but I just want to distinguish it from the other style, which I will get into later. So in this part, which I'm calling the first theme, this is the first theme of the first movement here. In this part, I'm using very short samples. They're not really complete musical measures. This should be kind of destabilizing the way that they're arranged. It's a little bit sharp. It's a little bit jagged. That's the idea that I'm going for here. And with this jagged section, these jagged parts, as I said, I'm only using songs that are kind of percussive, heavy. They're based on percussion. They kind of use animal sounds a lot of times. There's a lot of like weird animal sounds that are a part of this. The whole genre kind of uses it. I'm using that type of stuff. But it's an important note that none of the samples I'm using use vocals. However, many of the samples in different parts of the songs do have vocals. So I'm just going to flag that. That's going to be something that's very important. It's going to become important later in this movement. But that's a description, broad description of the first theme. There is also a contrasting section within the first theme. You know, I don't really want to get too much into detail. I'm kind of in a place where I don't know how much detail I want to share here, but anyway, there is a slightly contrasting part within the first theme where the themes are more cut in a less jagged way, but I don't want to get into too much detail because I think it bogged me down a little bit too much. Anyway, I do want to share a lot of things. So the reason why I even want to make this video is because I did a lot of things with this song, with this whole work, and I didn't write it down anywhere. So I only just kind of remember some of it. I don't remember all of it, but I want to be able to remember it for for the long term. That's why I kind of want to make this video. Anyway, there's a contrasting section. I'll be able to figure that out, I'm sure, in the future. Okay, and then that continues on to the second theme, of course. And I hope that the second theme is easily and recognizably, immediately different than the first. Here for the second theme, I'm using more lush recordings that include string orchestras. These are more lyrical and beautiful in a typical sense. This is what I'm going to be calling Hollywood exotica. This is a fake of the fake, right? It's really a appropriation of the appropriation of the appropriation. It's kind of going layered here because this type of exotica is it's a facsimile. I don't know why I just used that word. I don't like that word, but you know what? I hope you know what that word means. It's a facsimile of the true exotica, which is a facsimile of other foreign cultures, right? So it's a fake of a fake of a fake. We're appropriating many layers of appropriation here. Where I'm using this Hollywood exotica for this second theme, I'm doing it in such a way that they actually are much more fluid and flowing together and more lyrical. I'm using full bars oftentimes or half bars, so it doesn't feel as jagged. And here with this second theme, I'm actually using samples from 12 songs I'm not going to list all the 12 songs, and it's not super important. But what I mean here is I'm using 12 songs, not 12 recordings. There's a lot more recordings, but there are 12 compositions across many different recordings. And the reason why I'm doing this is just because Exotica albums from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they would all have 12 songs. This is actually very common for albums in that time frame. They would have 12 songs. So that's why I'm doing it. Not super important what the songs are. You could probably hear some of them. A lot of them are very familiar, common songs. And I will mention a few of them as I'm talking about it. So that just sets up the contrast between the first theme and the second theme. That is what we call the exposition section of a sonata form. In sonata form, you have the exposition. You expose the first theme and the second theme. And hopefully they're contrasting with each other, and that contrast is obvious. And then you continue into the development section or the elaboration section. I'm going to call it the elaboration section. That's the language I like here. So in regular classical music, the elaboration section takes the first two themes and puts them into new contexts. Sometimes they extend parts of the theme, or they fragment the themes. They usually put them into new keys, or they have different arrangements and different accompaniments. There are a lot of just different things going on there. But that presents a puzzle for me when creating this work of art. What does it mean to elaborate a sample if I'm making sample-based music? What does it mean to put a sample into a new key if I'm not editing any of the samples, right? I want this to be only the arrangement of these songs without any other editing. I'm just cutting them out. So what does it even mean to have a key center to change the key, to like transpose or to modulate? What does that even mean in this context of an appropriative collage? So this is where I get into some things that are actually innovative. This is my own personal innovation to the genre of plunderphonics or appropriative collage or whatever we're going to be calling it. This is my actual musical idea that is new and can be explored by anybody else. So what I'm doing is, in this piece, what we're calling an elaboration is going to be one of two things. The first, we're going to be sampling a different part of the same recording. So that will be one of the ways that we can elaborate. Like you can extend the recording, the part of the recording that you can extend the sample or the part of the recording that we used, or we can cut a different part of the sample. Or another elaboration would be sampling a different recording of the same composition. Those are going to be our two forms of elaboration. So in this case, I'm going to start with the first theme as it originally appears. Then I do a quick modulation, which is an elaboration of many of the parts. So I'll just play that out so it's obvious what I mean here. I want it to be recognizably the same as the first theme. So it's a very clear repeat of the first theme. But then there is but then it is also repeated with vocals. And that repeat with the vocals is the modulation, because I'm sampling a different part of each of these songs into a part that has vocals. And then that opens me up, that opens up the song, because now in this elaboration section, I'm going to be using a lot of samples from there that use vocals. It's opened us up into this new key center where we have vocals. So then I introduce many songs from the second theme, many samples from the second theme that have vocals. What I mean here is many different recordings from the same compositions that include vocal elements. And then I go through a series of various key centers, which are going to be defined. In this case, it starts being defined as including vocals, and then it gets defined in terms of the particular genre that we're using, and so on. I'm pretty much, I'm mostly using samples from the second theme. Occasionally I'm using some from the first theme. The first major key center that we jump into is instrumental jazz. So then now instead of using Hollywood Exotica samples, I'm using the same compositions, but they're all jazz renditions of these songs. And then I move over into a particular key center, or again, I'm calling it a key center. It's more of an analogy here, but I'm jumping into a particular key center that uses vocal jazz, specifically vocal jazz, mostly in mono. I want to go for mono as opposed to stereo. Both ears are going to be playing the exact same thing, so it's in mono. And I'm going to be focusing on two particular songs. Taboo, very common, very popular Exotica song, and another one called Miserliu, another popular and common Exotica song. And both of these are, interestingly enough, not from they don't originate in the Exotica genre. They are actually, there's some sort of traditional music. The Taboo is a Cuban song, I think, from the 30s, and Miserliu is like some sort of Mediterranean song. Maybe it's Greek or maybe it's something else. Origins unknown, it's not clear. And I use these two and I play with them, go back and forth between different recordings, and I create this amazing buildup, this amazing climax. And ignore the fact that there are not any other songs in this style of appropriative collage in sonata form. This is the best climax in appropriative collage sonata form ever to exist.
Ach ya habibi, ach ya leleli,
als ich will, mein
remember he isn't for you.
Oh, I knew this was mine.
Miseru haste, yea, they don't face.
Now that I've seen you,
Allah will bless.
moon and the sun, there is
And then move on to a section that's more about vocals. And I try to make some sort of coherent vocal chain, like a sentence or an utterance that makes sense vocally by cutting between multiple different songs. I didn't actually make something that made actual sense, but it makes some sort of like emotional sense, kind of, maybe, sort of. I thought so. I still think so. It makes some kind of sense in some kind of weird way. I really like the result of this. But I'm using samples that are longer, and they include words that are intelligible as words, and the words from different songs make some kind of a link together. They kind of flow together, but they don't make a coherent sentence if you were to read it out as a single sentence.
Our quest for the quiet village kept us pushing onward until...
In my quiet village I pray,
but you no longer care.
To me, return to me. Oh,
And after that, there's a little bit of a transition, and then we finish the elaboration, and then we come into the recapitulation, which is essentially a repeat of the exposition. Generally, the recapitulation is you repeat the first and the second themes from the original exposition. But this time, the second theme is modulated so that it is less contrasted, it is less differentiated from the first theme. They are more harmonious. It's changed in such a way that they are more harmonious. So you present both themes in the exposition, and they're different, they're differentiated. And then you, in the development section, you show how different they could be. You put them all into different contexts, and then you shake it up a lot, and then you bring them back together in the recapitulation phase, and you bring them back together in such a way that they are more harmonious with each other. They are less differentiated. Here's just kind of like a random structural thing. Like I was kind of unsure if I wanted to give a full repeat of the first theme. I ended up actually doing it, but I think if I were to make this type of song, this type of work today, I would prefer to actually make a truncated version of the first theme. I prefer it to be like more smooth and like flowing, but I wanted it to be more clear. The reason why I do a full repeat is because I wanted it to be clear what I was doing in terms of actually making it in sonata form. So anyway, there's like slight conflicting ideas in my mind while I was doing that. And, generally with classical era music, old school classical era classical music, they do like really clear full repeats of the entire section. But then we get into later romantic era classical music, they don't do repeats hardly at all. They just kind of, every single restatement of a theme is slightly different from the original. So two competing ideas there. Anyway, I do a full repeat of the first theme, and then we move on to the second theme. And again, the second theme needs to be reconciled with the first theme. It needs to be less differentiated when it is repeated in the recapitulation phase. And this is where we have another innovation that I have. It's the same innovation of the idea of how to elaborate a theme. So essentially, I'm doing a full modulation of the entire second theme. And so what is a modulation in this case? Is, as we saw earlier, all of the second theme is in this sort of Hollywood exotica form. But as we heard in the development section, in the elaboration section, there are many different recordings from different genres. And for this case, to make it reconcile with the first theme, I introduce the genre, the true exotica genre. So I only pull from samples of the compositions using this true exotica genre. And I essentially do a one-for-one replacement of each of the samples as they appeared in the first time that the second theme was shown, which was in this Hollywood exotica form. Do a one-for-one replacement with a true exotica variant. So again, that kind of it makes it seem as if the key, the genre called true exotica is the key of this entire work. That's kind of how it turned out to be. And here we can see that the Hollywood exotica is really not so different from the true exotica. That's kind of the vibe I wanted to go for with that modulation. I don't really know if it makes a lot of sense, but that's the vibe I was going for. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, we have the exotica, and then we have the Hollywood exotica, and we transform the Hollywood exotica into the true exotica. And all along, it was this sort of paradise, tropical paradise type of vibe. We were actually there all along. We had it the whole time. We were in paradise all along. Feels kind of silly trying to verbalize what I was going for musically here. So all of this heavily aligns with my current ideas of music and how beauty and art and beauty contain abstract patterns, which can appear in many different mediums and different works of art. So obviously the classical musical form is an abstract pattern which appears in many different songs, many different works from the classical era of classical music, and it appears in later eras of classical music. And it could apply and appear in more modern forms of music. It usually doesn't, but it could. Occasionally you have works of art, I think like Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that the theme made by John Williams, I think that's actually in sonata form. Occasionally you get some kind of weird things like that, but it doesn't really happen very often. You don't see it in terms of pop music, or you don't see it in experimental music. So, but it is an abstract form, and it is applicable to those. So it could appear in all of those forms, or any different environment could have that form. Any different environment of works of art could have that bit of knowledge in it. So anyway, that's one of the abstract ideas that's being highlighted by this work of art. And then, of course, the abstract idea of exotica and many different types of exotica, that's a part of the work of art. And then, and more specifically, the abstract idea of a composition being able to take many different forms and work in different contexts, that's another part of it. So all of these ideas of abstraction and abstract patterns that show up in many different works of art, all of that is kind of being highlighted by this. And I think music does that quite a lot. Music highlights the abstract nature of beauty and patterns in a work of art. Okay, on to the second movement. I'm not actually going to do it from here. I'm going to do it in a different environment. Second movement is called Beneath the Surface. This is a much less complicated thing than the first movement. It is an appropriative collage, and it is in the minuet form. It's mostly using samples from the classical era. There's no processing, and there are 2 trios. The minuet attempts to make standard sounding classical era themes out of classical era recordings using similar sounding compositions from various genres. It should be noted that genre here means the thing that genre means in classical music. So a genre in classical music is like solo piano is a genre, and then a violin sonata is a genre because it has a violin and a piano, and then a piano trio is a genre because it has a piano. It's more about the type of instrumentation that's being used. That's what I mean in this sense. Here's the first theme from this minuet. There's a piano trio by Beethoven, there's a symphony by Haydn, and there's I think I don't remember the genre, but there's something by Mozart. It's a common one. And then there's a symphony by Brahms. These are some composers I just really like. Okay, and the first trio is also very similar. It's the same idea, same type of style. There's nothing too spectacular to be noted about that. It's the same idea. I'll play a little bit of that too. After that first trio, the minuet repeats. So just the first theme is what I called it a second ago. That repeats and just starts again. And then after a bit, it goes into a second trio. The second trio is a little bit more strange. It's more abstract. It's actually heavily processed. There's a lot of processing going on, something repeated, something going slower. There's some other weird processing going on. So this is the first time in the entire sonata cycle that we have a looped sample or anything that's repeating in that directly repeating way. I have samples slowed down. I have some samples overlapping. There's, I think it's FM synthesis that I'm doing with, I haven't pulled up the software to remember what I did. I'm not really remembering. It just sounds like FM synthesis to me. And I exclusively use late romantic and impressionistic recordings, as opposed to the first trio and the first theme, which is called a minuet. Those are using classical era music. And Brahms, I'm just going to consider Brahms to be classical era, because why not? He's kind of classical in spirit, you know what I mean? This movement should make the philosophy clear. Classical musicians, they shared ideas, they shared instrumentation, and so on. So shared ideas between each other, and then the evolution of those shared ideas between each other. All of that is a part of this abstraction of musical ideas, which I call beauty, of course, and it being put into different contexts and being used by different musicians. And then in this sense, they're actual specific musical ideas that seem to carry over. The Mannheim rocket, I think it's called, which is that's used in so many different compositions. It's all the same ideas being used and abstracted into different contexts. And then we jump on into the third movement. This is a much simpler movement, even still simpler. It's called folding onto oneself. It is more of an intermission than anything else. I didn't really want to do a slow movement. Well, I did want to do it, but I didn't want to do it poorly, so I just didn't do it. There's a whole thing in a slow movement. Oftentimes, for classical era slow movements, the secondary theme would be in the subdominant key. And there's something about that that feels really special when you're listening to classical music, because usually the second theme is in the dominant key. So when it comes in the subdominant key, it has a certain feeling to it. In any case, I couldn't figure out a way to make that more apparent that we're using a different type of modulation. So I just kind of dropped the whole thing, made an intermission. That just means that it's unstructured. It doesn't have there's no particular themes or contrast between themes. It's just looping. There's some samples going on. There's some processing happening, a lot of repeated things. It's cool. And then we come to the fourth movement. This is the finale. It's called Repurposing Consciousness. It's in rondo sonata form. I love it, and it's a focus on jazz. Okay, I love rondo sonata form just because it's like a large form. I'm mostly using unprocessed samples, with one section having a little bit of processed samples and some uniquely recorded audio. What I mean by that is, this is not purely an appropriative collage. Everything else has been only appropriative collage. In this movement, I actually record stuff myself, in which case I'm not appropriating it, I'm just using my own recordings. So I'm playing with mostly jazz. There's also some world music that's being used in here, and all of this is meant to play off of the idea of exoticism that started with the first movement of this entire sonata cycle. So even the recordings that I made personally, they kind of play off of the theme of exoticism. At least I'm trying to. I'm not sure how obvious it is for me to be using like world music, because I use world music here and exotica, and then like I'll explain a little bit of the recordings that I made. I'm not sure how obvious that is, that those are connected in some way. It might just only be obvious to me, but that's what I'm talking about it. In the classical tradition, the rondo sonata form is a form that has a refrain, that's the primary theme, and it's repeated several times. You start with the refrain, and then you get it contrasted by what's called an episode. The episode interrupts the refrain, and then you go back to the refrain, and then you get to another episode, and then you go back to a refrain, and then you get to another episode. When you have it in rondo sonata form, it kind of brings in the sonata form a little bit by having some of the episodes be modulations of each other. That's really it. For this piece, I'm using a refrain that is all jazz, and it's using very, very jagged samples. By that, I just mean that I'm cutting them in very strange ways. This is really impossible to really catch on to anything that's happening. You're just kind of being thrown in the washer machine of these sounds, trying to understand the context of this song as it's playing, and then it cuts and then goes to another one, and trying to understand that, and it cuts and it goes to another one. And you have all these different things that are bouncing around. Jagged, very sharp. I'm using small band combos. So I just like small band jazz as opposed to big band jazz. And sometimes there's a little bit of vocals in it, but rarely. These are mostly from the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. Each sample is really cut. They're cut off beat. I want this landscape of like unfamiliar rhythms and weird timings. And I want to build a theme out of these like really unfamiliar cuts that when they come back, like when you first hear it, it should be very unfamiliar and strange, but it repeats several times. So as it repeats, it'll sound more and more familiar, and it'll make more sense. That's why my hope to it. And as it sounds more familiar, it sounds less frantic and less crazy.
Get her out of my system.
So you should get used to that a little bit, and then we jump into the first episode, interrupting a refrain. So in the first episode, I'm using only world music, and the samples are very long, extremely, extremely long, contrasting with the short samples of the refrain. In this episode, all of the samples also overlap with something else. So there's overlapping at the beginning and the ending of each sample, and much less jagged. In fact, not jagged at all. It should be all smooth and like wave-like. Things are slowly fading in. Things are slowly fading out. Many recordings, they all build up together, and they kind of interlock in some places to have some sort of things happening. And the refrain comes back. And here in rondo form, sticking with rondo form, when the refrain comes back, it is not a direct repeat. It is a altered repeat. So you get like a variation. And I would hope that it is recognizably the same theme, because I'm using similar samples, not always the same sample. A lot of times I'm using the same sample. Every time I bring back the same sample, I am cutting it slightly differently, but it's still the same sample recognizably, I think.
Get her out of my system.
This one, it should be faster. So I think it's faster, but it sounds not frantic, which is just because it's more familiar. I think that's the goal, at least. Okay, then we come into the second episode, which is much more abstract than anything that we've seen before so far in any other part of this song, I think, and any other parts of the movements of the entire sonata cycle. Is it actually true that it's more abstract? It's quite abstract. Okay. I'm using 3 musical recordings that are looped. I won't really explain what they are, but something to do with exotica, something to do with jazz, a little bit of blues in there too. I'm using some recordings that are interesting to me, and I'm looping those. They're looped. And then I'm having 3 of my own personal recordings that I've recorded. I don't know why I said that so weirdly. At some point in time, I bought microphones. I went out into the wild and I started recording things. I used to do it a lot. And then that stopped. I didn't do it a lot at some point. Anyway, so you're getting some recordings. One from a burn I went to. It's called Alchemy. It's a local burn for Georgia. It still goes on. It's really fun. I haven't gone in a long time though. This is just a bunch of people screaming around a burning effigy. I'm not going to really explain what a burn is, but it's a bunch of hippies and they like to set stuff on fire. The second recording is a little bit more subtle. It's also processed a whole lot, so it comes in different ways, but it's just a metallic switch, from a lamp. It's from a loud lamp that was in my room. And it's just clicking, and it's also processed to make a sort of tonal sound. And then the third is even more prominent. That is a roller coaster. I took I took a microphone. I took a shotgun microphone to Six Flags and recorded the roller coaster called Superman. And it sounds really nice. I just thought it sounded really cool. So this is something that I am a fan of. I mean, I guess I can't be a fan of it. I'm the only one who's done this. I think this is the problem. Okay. I've not heard other people do this type of thing. I've not heard other music doing this type of thing where they're contrasting different types of so-called experimental music. Remember, I don't like this term experimental music, but they're not contrasting like what I'm doing here is appropriative collage contrasted with the sort of field recordings that are processed. I've not heard this type of thing contrasted within a singular work, like a single song having both of those things, a section of one, a section of another. Anyway, I think it's super cool. I just like it. I like the screaming in different contexts. They're both happy, exciting contexts to hear people screaming. Of course, that's a major part of the whole point of people being in paradise, right? Repurposing consciousness. Also, that might have something to do with a bunch of hippies. They're all on LSD and ketamine and other drugs. I don't know what the heck they were doing over there. That's a part of the feeling of being in paradise. That's a part of the feeling of repurposing your consciousness. It's all kind of working together there in some way, I think. Okay, then we come back to the refrain again. This time it's more chill, the refrain. It is still using cut samples, but they're more cut on beats. They kind of, they seem more aligned together. You kind of feel like you're kind of, you makes more sense every time. Every sample being used, the context of that sample kind of makes more sense, and they flow together between each other. That's the goal, at least. And then we come into, after that, the third episode. Third episode is a direct modulation of the first episode. So every one of the recordings that were used initially, which were world music recordings, every one of those recordings are matched with a jazz song. And the jazz recordings are from a range. Some of them are just small band. Some of them are big band. A lot of them are big band. They're just different things. So it's a little bit more of a wider conception of what jazz is. It's not just like the kind of bebop and like derivatives of bebop jazz, which is what I was going for the small combos. And then after that, really nice final episode with that cool modulation. Again, I just like the whole idea of having a modulated section using appropriative collage. After that, we get back into a final refrain. Samples are slightly extended. It should sound more relaxed. It should sound more like concluding in some way. It sounds like a finish. And then we finish, and then we have a full conclusion to our entire sonata cycle. We did it.
Get her out of my...
Okay, there you go. That's my attempt to combine experimental music with classical music. I'm working with appropriative collage and putting them all into classical music forms, specifically the sonata forms. I think it's a giant mistake for people doing making experimental music to completely abandon any existing musical forms or existing musical knowledge, or even other artistic knowledge, because I'm sure there's a lot of other knowledge to be had in different parts of the artistic world to bring into experimental music or experimental whatever, film, and all these other things can bring things from other people or from other places. I like the appropriation of knowledge from other places. I don't think that using existing knowledge contradicts or conflicts with experimenting and creating new knowledge. This is all relevant to the idea of the Lydian chromatic concept, which I will talk about in a lot of detail in a different video. But it's like a jazz concept of putting things into new contexts and developing a clear understanding of the boundary of where this thing can go into one context and it will be what's called ingoing, and where you can put into a different context and it's called outgoing or far out. You know, people say far out, dude. This is kind of the idea there. Anyway, there's like a systematic way of bounding musical concepts and putting them into new contexts to see how far out they are, how ingoing they are. The same thing can be done with just regular knowledge in music. Anyway, that's a bit off topic. This is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, I guess. I really hope that I just explained a lot of the things that I wanted to explain. And maybe this will be helpful for myself to understand this music at a later point. Maybe anybody else who's interested. I couldn't imagine. I don't know. Maybe somebody would be interested in my music. I guess it'd be great if you were interested and you could tell what I was thinking about it. So yeah, that's what that's for.